Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salam, hello, peace to you all. Welcome to Office Hours with Professor Adnan Husain. I am Adnan Husain. In this special edition, we've returned to our regularly scheduled time, 5 p.m. on Fridays, after having a wonderful special episode with Nihal Al-Asar. Go check it out if you haven't already listened to that edition that happened earlier this week on Monday. But we're back here on Fridays for a casual drop-in. This time I don't have a guest myself, and I'm coming to you live from London, UK, where I'm traveling to attend a conference, and I've organized a conference. So I'm here for my scholarly interests, and I'm off from here to Istanbul after that and giving a lecture at Koç University. So I'll be traveling for the next couple of weeks, but I did not want to leave you without an office hour episode, if at all possible. So even though it's 10 p.m. here rather than 5 p.m., and I had a red-eye overnight flight, I managed to take a little cat nap in the afternoon, and I'm feeling good. I'm ready to talk history with all of you about why it's so fascinating, why it's so interesting, and why it's so necessary for our analysis of the world. I have a couple of announcements to make, which is just that next week we won't have office hours because I'll be on my way back to Canada, and I'll be in transit, and there's just no way possible really to do it from the Via Rail train. Actually, I have to tell you that I mean, it's great that the Via Rail, the train, the Amtrak of Canada, Via Rail, has free Wi-Fi on it. However, on my way here to the UK, the train I was on my way to the airport, had a 4-hour delay. Actually, might have been 4.5-hour delay. So, you know, it's not a very reliable mode of transportation. It's chronically underfunded, and it doesn't even own its own tracks. The tracks belong to, commercial Canada Rail, which is the kind of commercial transport for, goods and so on, these long, huge trains. They own the tracks, and so they don't prioritize the needs for passenger trains. And so Canada has an expensive and not very efficient rail system, which I almost was a victim of in not being able to make my flight. So anyway, so I'm here in London, and I wanted to have a chance to talk with you all. The second, so the first announcement was simply that next week I'll be on my return, so I won't be able to have office hours, but I do expect to have office hours again weekly on Fridays, and we will be having guests. I can announce already that David Schmid, who's a professor of English at SUNY Buffalo, and an old friend and colleague who works on genre fiction, modern genre fiction, including horror fiction. He wrote a collection, or has a collection, on zombies, and he's just got a wonderful kind of Marxist analysis of popular culture, is going to be joining me on Friday, October 31st. So join me for a special Halloween edition coming up at the end of this month, where we'll be talking about culture and horror in these times of genocide. That should be a very interesting conversation for Halloween. So at any rate, I wanted to get into this. It's great to see people coming in. Of course, I also have to tell you, please do like this stream. This is going to be a much more free-form, open kind of chat and discussion with you. So, I'm expecting to have a really good time engaging with you all in this community. But, invite others, let them know about it. You can like the stream so that more people will hear about it. You can share it on your social media right now. We're also streaming live on Twitter. And if you are watching on Twitter X, you can retweet that stream and make sure more people can come to this conversation. And also, if you would like to support this channel and the public educational project here that I'm involved in, of course, you can go to patreon.com/Adnan Husain or make a one-time contribution, buymeacoffee.com/Adnan Husain. But all right, I'm here for a conference on Ibn Khaldun, who is a 14th and early 15th century medieval Muslim scholar and administrator and bureaucrat, you could say, who was also a historian, and he wrote a major world history, the Kitab al-Ibar, the book of lessons, that is a sort of world global history that focuses mostly on North Africa, but tries to talk about the Islamicate East and further afield, even includes information about Europe and in Africa and so forth. So he was attempting in that period of time to write what he understood as something like a global history. But even more interestingly than the project of writing a universal or world history, which was something that's common in the age of premodern empires. And you have Roman historians, of course, whose conception of the world was, patterned by the view from Rome. But then also you have this tradition of global or world history being incorporated also in the Arab Islamic East. And you have Persian historians who also tried to write world histories. And so it's kind of a common genre that this figure, Ibn Khaldun, who was from North Africa, was engaging in. What's more exciting and interesting about him, and the reason perhaps we're having this conference that I've organized to study his thought in a contemporary frame, the title of the conference is called Thinking with Ibn Khaldun. And the idea is not just to study his ideas and his historical approach and understanding and put it in the context of his time as an object of intellectual history and intellectual historical study, but actually to think with him, with his work, with his ideas in a more contemporary frame in the ways that some of these ideas might be extended or interpreted or challenged or reworked in light of insights that it might grant us into our own contemporary kind of social and historical world. And the reason why I think it's important to do that is because most of our theory, social theory, political theory, derives from, and in fact you could say, the objects of most of Western philosophy derives from the experience of Europe and of the West and how it saw its own past. And this is an issue that when we are talking about social movements, social struggles, and the theories through which we understand liberation and the process of freeing ourselves from contemporary consumer capitalism, for example, if our sources of theory are limited only to the way in which they were informed by Western historical experience, they might be fairly limited in their value for liberation struggles and contestations from other parts of the world. And so the idea behind this conference that I'm organizing is that we need to globalize and broaden the sources and genealogies of theory outside of just the Western frame. And this is a problem even, you could say, in Marxism. There have been really interesting critiques and studies of some of the limitations and problems of what is called Western Marxism, as opposed to other Marxist traditions, particularly those that have arisen and developed in the global South. And I was just reading and starting to read a book which, in fact, actually, my friend and colleague and comrade Benji from Resistance is Fertile, who I see has joined the chat and is on the stream, sent me a reference to it, and actually, well, I shouldn't say that he sent me the PDF. He showed me where I could get a hold of this book, which I've ordered, through the library. But he was about global Marxism, and I think this is an important discussion, and I think that we can only enhance and deepen the critique of Western theory to broaden it so that it can encompass a broader liberatory struggle globally if we have a deeper knowledge and understanding of our own possibilities for thinking through social questions, social problems. And in fact, I have to say, Benji is actually joining us in this conference. I'm really looking forward to his comments and discussion in a couple of days at this conference. But the reason why I wanted to start with that is because that's one of the principal reasons I came to London. The second one is that I'm participating in a really exciting new professional organization that is holding its first annual conference called Society for the Study of the Past. And it'll be, having its first sessions in the days following the Ibn Khaldun conference that I just mentioned I'm organizing, also at the Open University here in the UK. And this professional organization for historicist scholars, and I say that specifically rather than historians, is because it imagines a broader way of engaging and dealing with the past. One of the things that has always attracted me to the study of history is that basically from my perspective, which is a historicist perspective, any part of human culture or society or intellectual production that happened in the past is an object of history. It's valid for an approach to studying it because the method, history is not just what happened, what is behind us. It is, of course, that, but it's also a method and approach to studying that past and to informing how we think through questions using contextual analysis and understanding temporality. And that's something very important. When we try and talk about deeper ways of thinking through problems beyond the surface level of events or discourses or propaganda, or decisions that are being made in the political sphere, we often talk about deeper structural conditions, right? So if you think of that, it's like imagining in spatial terms that there are surface events and then there are deeper causes that explain or understand the parameters by which events take place or unfold, or that condition the horizons of possibility because there are formations of social power, of social relations, of material resources in the way that they're configured socially, that all tend to propound towards a certain kind of outcome, right? So when we talk about racism, for example, and we push the analysis beyond the incidence of someone, being subject to, vitriolic or vituperative abuse with, racial epithets that demean them or draw upon stereotypes in an overt and direct way, obviously we can recognize that as coming from racist attitudes, prejudices, and bigotry. But if we only thought about the problem of racism as the cases or the acts that overtly demonstrate some form of discriminatory attitude, or if we thought of it only as something that was objective and measurable in the way that, for example, University of Chicago students who were trying to desegregate university housing controlled by the University of Chicago sent, a black couple, to try and apply for married student housing, and were denied with exactly the same kinds of qualifications and were told that there were no vacancies. when subsequently the same group of students organizing to demonstrate and document racism in the housing administration and housing policies of the University of Chicago sent a white couple, graduate students as well, and were welcomed and shown an empty apartment that they might choose to live in. They were able to demonstrate a specific case of discrimination, right, on the basis of race. Well, if we want to move beyond just those kinds of understandings of racism, we often talk about how there is structural racism. There are underlying kind of habitus and procedures and practices and resources mobilized in various ways through institutions and so on that act to exclude and to discriminate in less active and overt ways, but nonetheless condition the horizons of possibility, for people, and end up patterning certain kinds of outcomes as more likely and more reliable. That's what we mean by talking about structural conditions. That's pretty much on the basis of a kind of spatial model of thinking of a deeper underlying set of organized practices, for example. Structures, however, are considered very stable. And in doing our analysis of structures, we abstract them from the events and suggest that very rarely do these change. They may change over time, but the point is that they are embedded and keep reproducing certain historical conditions, outcomes, and cases. What's important, and that's something that's very important in many of the disciplines of the human social sciences, but what history really provides is also a sense of change and continuity and the temporality of structures, how major events might reframe. Why do major kind of events happen and have consequences on subsequent structures, for example? And so the theoretical insight that's really important with history is that it's a method for really thinking through both contextual analysis, but also the temporality by which we experience life in society, right? Nothing that happens. So this is what's so remarkable about these nostalgic, right-wing, reactive, attempts at historical recovery and recuperation. Make America great again. Nothing that happens in history can be returned to in exactly the same way, because the temporality of experience ensures that it is something different and that you have to take into account. Nothing that happens later is possible to analyze without understanding that it has happened after other things have happened that have consequences upon these future events. It's basically like what Marx says, when every generation or every people, has to make history themselves, right? Like what we do in our social work, in our societies, in our political contestations and actions and so on, is we are making history. Like by living, we are making history in our time. But we don't choose the conditions under which we make it. We cannot choose those conditions because, temporally speaking, we inherit the conditions from the prior time. And that's a kind of theoretical insight that is very important for understanding what the method of history is and why it's a unique and separate discipline that isn't just sort of talking about and describing what happened in the past, but that contributes something theoretically to how we think through social questions, political questions, economic questions at the level of theory. So this Society for the Study of the Past is not just for historians in the narrow sense of people who fit within the discipline of history, are professional historians, and are working in that field and teaching classes that are labeled in an academic sense as history. It's all people who are interested and vested in understanding and studying the past in all its variety of components. And as I said right at the outset, one of the reasons why I love history so much is because I think it's so wide open. whatever has happened, any element of culture, intellectual production, as I said, or political change that has happened in the past is an object of study, can be an object of study if you take a historicist approach. So why is this new professional organization founded? It is actually in precise response to the fact that a year and a half ago, approximately a year and a half ago, it might be a little bit under a year and a half ago, the American Historical Association, the largest professional organization for historians and people who are teaching history and studying history in the academic discipline. This is their professional organization. Canada has one, the CHA. These bodies are often national ones, but the American Historical Association is one of the biggest because there's such a large, academic set of institutions and people teaching in it. Then there's thousands of members in the American Historical Association. Those members voted to pass a resolution condemning scholasticide in Gaza, the utter destruction of the entire, well, not only the destruction of the universities, but also, especially for historians, the destruction of archival records, of libraries, these archival collections of archaeological sites and sources. All of this was an attempt at erasing the past of the Palestinians over the course of this genocide. It's also a kind of cultural genocide that is really targeted at the examples and the testimonies and the evidence of a long history of peoples living in Palestine who don't necessarily fit into the narrative of the Bronze Age Israelite Jewish settlements, that are described, in the Bible, right? The Bible only talks about a small sliver of the history of Palestine. And of course, the evidence of all these other eras of Jewish kingdom, Philistines and Canaanites, and the subsequent periods of Romans and Nabatean settlement, and into the era of Roman and Christian suzerainty over Palestine, and then on into the medieval period, late antique, you might say, and medieval period under Arab Muslim rule, and then subsequently under the Ottomans. These are all historical eras that have contributed to the history of this land and of the peoples who live there, and so the genocide to create a pure, Jewish supremacist Zionist entity, political entity, and society has a stake in erasing Palestinian, histories, all these varieties of histories. And so the American Historical Association's members passed a motion to condemn this. And it was overturned by its board of governors, who went against the majority of its members who had expressed a clear concern about the destroying of history, the destroying of the possibility of studying history, the destroying of the entire academy and university system and education system of Gaza. So in response to this, it just seemed impossible to continue to be a member of the American Historical Association. I wrote a letter, resigned my membership, and said that I would never renew my membership until they reversed this decision and allowed the members to express their view as custodians of the study of the past. And some colleagues in response started this new professional organization, Society for the Study of the Past, to try and move beyond the craven, decision of the leadership of this major historical professional organization for academics. And I have to say, overall, all of these, professional organizations for academics have been incredibly disappointing during this time. Instead of standing up, even if all they could do was stand up for the right to education and the fact that schools and universities should not be targets of military violence. I mean, at the very least, you could say that. I mean, what does that really cost you in terms of your principles? But the lack of courage, the cravenness, the complicity that they've shown has truly been astonishing. And frankly, we have to say, even those so-called leftist scholars, many of whom who study or the histories, the literatures, the cultures of resistance and frame themselves and call themselves, decolonial scholars who have been silent during this time is truly astonishing and disappointing and has to be challenged. And that's one reason why the Society for the Study of the Past has been formed, and I'm participating in that conference later this week, and I can certainly talk a little bit more about what I'll be talking about there and about narratives of history, and particularly ways of thinking about the early Muslim conquests in the region that have been attempted in both Orientalist and Zionist scholarship, and of course now increasingly in propaganda. You can see it just on social media as a way of saying that the Arabs, the Muslims, the Palestinians don't belong on that land and that they are colonizers and that Zionism is a liberation movement. Okay, so there's so much to unpack there, and I'll be giving a presentation to discuss that, about the uses of history in the way it is kind of twisting a process that was a slow process over hundreds of years in order to delegitimize the indigenous people of the land as part of a settler colonial project. So we can talk a lot more about that. But that's kind of what I wanted to say just at the outset, why I'm here in London, why I'm at this particular moment really thinking about what's at stake in history, why we study history, and how we study history in order that we might approach it in such a way that it can be a resource for us in a liberatory, just, and equitable future. And that's, of course, why I started Guerrilla History Podcast with Henry Hakamaki and Brett O'Shea some years ago. And that's been kind of a real inspiration and guiding kind of point, a guiding star to follow is how we might use history to condition our thinking and our practice in such a way that we can struggle better, more effectively for the future. So studying the past, I think, is always about what kind of a future you intend to envision. So I'm going to pause there, and then I'm going to try and open it up and maybe talk about some more specifics. That was kind of broad, theoretical sort of overviews. I'd love to talk a little bit more about Ibn Khaldun. In fact, I have some passages from his work in translation that I've identified that I think would be really interesting to discuss and speak about in a more careful, slow way, using it as a primary source for thinking through critical reading, thinking through questions about history, the relationship between history and social theory, because as we'll hopefully may discover, Ibn Khaldun actually in some ways seems to invent ways of studying society that we might recognize as political science, sociology, anthropology, basically the social sciences, in developing what he might call a philosophy of history, in attempting to demonstrate that history wasn't, as it was dismissed by Aristotle and those who followed the intellectual tradition of the so-called liberal arts, in the Western tradition, the trivium and the quadrivium, these kind of kind of way of organizing knowledge of the time as what's fundamental, and then what follows after you have the foundations of like math, logic and rhetoric, and so forth. That then you build, other kinds of studies that can be more specialized. But there was this way of thinking: what is a science, i.e., what is philosophical? A science is something that has norms, rules, and laws, whereas history was regarded as merely the evanescent, kind of specific detail of experience for which there really wasn't any organizing pattern or principles, higher principles and laws by which it could be understood and studied. It were specific anecdotes. You might draw edifying moral lessons from them, like a fable, except that they're supposed to be true. So there's a whole, kind of interesting discussion to be had there about, how the history of history, as it were, like of the way people thought of the value of history. And one thing Ibn Khaldun is trying to do rather innovatively for the time, and we can look at those passages where he talks a little bit about it, saying, I haven't found anybody who's really looked at it this way. His attempt to put it on foundations that would make it comparable to other kinds of sciences or disciplines of knowledge that the philosophers, believed were foundational and had normative rules that could be abstracted from the specifics, right? Okay, so that's some of what, I hope we might be able to get to if you're interested, but I also want to open it up to, all of your kinds of questions and thoughts, either about what I've said or other things that we could bring up. This is meant to be a very informal. I don't have a guest. It's, just an opportunity to have these kinds of discussions and so it's based very much on what also you might find interesting and what you want to contribute. So I'm happy to take questions and to talk further about other things and to read some of your comments and so forth. If there aren't too many of those, then we may get into some specifics about Ibn Khaldun or about, the paper that a presentation I'm supposed to be giving in a couple of days. But I first want to just remind everybody, like the stream, let others join this conversation and learn about it, get it onto their feeds in the algorithm. So if you're watching now, hit the like button. And I do hope you might subscribe to the channel so that you can be updated. As I said, like, next week there isn't an office hours, and you might think, oh, maybe they're not doing them on, Fridays anymore. We had a reschedule for the previous edition of office hours and held it on Monday with Nihal Al-Asar. So the best way to keep up with what's happening is to follow me on X or Instagram at Adnan A. Husain, or to subscribe to the channel so that you'll get notified about it, okay? And do share it on social media. If you're watching on X, tweet it out, okay? But also just to acknowledge all the people who have come in: Ode to John Trudell, VM. It's great to see all of these people who have been coming to live streams of office hours and struggle sessions regularly. It's great to be building a community and getting to know you. I see other people, Red Kitty, Joe Umami, okay, from the Autonomous Collective. People are coming in from there as well. And I do want to mention also an announcement, and I hope people in the chat are following and are taking whatever directions and suggestions Benji is encouraging people to do of Resistance is Fertile, because they have been banned on YouTube. That's something that just happened really recently, and we need to be in solidarity with our comrades and colleagues, not only for some general principle of free speech, but the fact that they are targeting sources of genuine knowledge and analysis that is meant to confront this genocide, confront the settler colonialism, to confront the ravages of imperialism and capitalism globally. And Resistance is Fertile has characterized itself, I believe, so beautifully as the psychological support front against imperialism and for the resistance. So they've been targeted and they've been suppressed, and perhaps Benji has put in the YouTube comments where people can register their solidarity and their desire to see the ban lifted so that we can continue to have the benefit of the psychological, anti-imperialist, anti-colonial insights of Benji, Sasha, Nunja, all the co-hosts of Resistance is Fertile. Also, I just want to see, if any questions, might have come in, and topics. You can also, suggest topics that you would like. And even if we don't get to them this time on this particular live stream, we will get to them, in future episodes. I won't always have guests. I'd like to be able to do this as an opportunity for good discussion in a relaxed sort of manner, pop into my office. We have a good discussion at the end of the week. You've been working hard and been busy, and this is a chance to kind of explore your interests and curiosity in good conversation and good discussion, which is what we try and do here. So there are ways you can follow still on other platforms. Resistance is Fertile, so do check those out as well. Alexander Luchte says, what I have learned is that you only learn from history for real if you actually learned something. You can also block your view on the presence or worst case, and in a galactic, mind frick like Germany. Okay, excellent point. We were all called to learn. In fact, there was a period where, I think one of the most popular areas of study, certainly with students and certainly in popular history, writing, of popular books and things like that, was World War II history and the history of Nazism and fascism. And so much has been discussed about, this era and this period because it was such a trauma, particularly in Europe, with millions upon millions of casualties. But it was also a global war that, really earned the term World War in ways that perhaps the World War I, although I have some colleagues who are doing real important World War I studies to try and globalize it a bit further and actually tell the stories and the consequences and the contributions of other parts of the world in that war from 1914 to 1918 and its particular aftermath, particularly for the Middle East. A colleague of mine, Elizabeth Thompson, has been doing some really wonderful work with a group of historians, really talking about World War I. So they would contest my point that World War II really was global. But I guess what I wanted to say about that is following what Alexander has mentioned here, is that there's been so much study of that history. It's been told, the stories, what happened, the Holocaust, the terrors of Nazism, of fascism. And yet, here we are today, where the lessons of that history have never really fully been absorbed and adopted by Europe, by the West in particular. What they found is a way to avoid, in some sense, really confronting the depravities, of capitalism and colonialism. It just reminds me, I often quote this statement by Aimé Césaire in Discourse on Colonialism, or at least I refer to it because I don't quote it precisely off the cuff and off the top of my head. But he is writing in 1955, which is really a great year, the year of the Bandung Conference, the Afro-Asian Conference in Bandung, Indonesia, and the year that he published this book, Discourse on Colonialism, where he contextualized the shocking horror of Nazism was something that Europe has come to emphasize as so totally devastating and unparalleled historically only because they only because it was happening to Europeans, and that colonialism for hundreds of years had been subjecting Black and brown and Asian, African, and indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere to a vicious form of violence, settler colonialism, and colonial domination, colonial war. That was basically racist. It was fascism, but it was not called fascism because it was being perpetrated upon the peoples of the global South, racial others, cultural others, and so forth. So I think this is a really important point, is that you can study the history, you can learn a lot of information. You can hear the stories, you can see documentaries, you can be impressed with the kind of minor details that so often are part of like military history. There's all these documentaries about the various battles of World War II, and you can get involved in the minutia of what happened without understanding why it happened, how it happened, and how to stop it from happening ever again, and really confronting what are the causes for unleashing such kind of violence upon the world. And that's the question that really needs to be asked. So when we study the past, I think if you want to study the past for a just future, that's the kind of question we need to ask, and actually demand that our leaders and our intellectuals and our media and the curricula in our universities actually address themselves to this object, this concern, which is actually learning something from history rather than learning about history, about what happened. Because how else is it possible to have talked so much, to have condemned the Nazis and the fascists, and miss the way in which the Zionist entity right now is perpetuating a form of fascistic settler colonial violence that was supposedly anathema to civilized, modern society. So that's a great point. I'm really glad that you made it. Looking through, I'm wondering actually, where we should go. Do you want to do a little more precise kind of discussion of, say, Ibn Khaldun? I'd love to do some close textual analysis. I could read, maybe I might be able to find the passages online and then actually share screen. That might be something for me to learn how to do better as a very recent YouTube live streamer without a lot of confidence and skills in being able to do anything other than turn the camera on and talk to it, and highlight a couple comments and so forth. But it might be also visually a little more interesting than just constantly, kind of watching me speak into the camera, to actually look at some passages if I can figure out how to do it. But if that's something we want to do. Ode to John Trudell mentions, has anyone else read Hayden White's Meta-History? Great point and a great question, and related very much to something that I wanted to talk about when discussing the narratives of history and the narratives of the early Islam in the Zionist and Orientalist sort of historiography. That methodological work by Hayden White called Meta-History. I forget the subtitle, but he also had another book that was about emplotments of narrative. But what he did was he basically said, sort of returned to this pre-scientific. I mentioned moral lessons, anecdotes, the specific, the didactic. This was an orientation around the value of history that was seen as antithetical to scientific knowledge, right? Philosophical knowledge. because it was just very kind of evanescent and specific, and you might moralize about it, about these anecdotes, but you wouldn't necessarily think that what it's describing in terms of human society followed any discernible patterns that could be studied as a science, a philosophical discipline of knowledge itself. That older kind of pre-scientific understanding of history, which is more a modern conception, and that's why Ibn Khaldun is so interesting, because he's deliberating on these kinds of ideas about method and the space and place of history and the social sciences and social theory fairly early on, like in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, as I mentioned. This older kind of tradition, however, around history saw it as very close to literary pursuits. It was valuable because it was an example that you could draw upon. So it could be sources of political wisdom by modeling yourself on the precedents and the teachings of and examples of previous rulers. And there was a whole genre that developed that might be seen as a proto-theoretical discipline of like political science, a manual of statecraft, these mirrors for princes, that is advice to rulers about how to be a wise and successful ruler, that very often developed their kind of principles of political wisdom and of administrative practice and of balancing opposition and techniques, basically, for being an effective politician and ruler. They were often based on historical examples. Like, so this happened, and you find this, for example, like this happened in, the era of Ardashir, or of Alexander, or of Cyrus the Great, or of Julius Caesar, etc. And stories, whether true or not, will be told about the examples of great rulers or military figures of the past that might be used now to educate aspiring governors and rulers with the appropriate mechanisms of both comportment, how to act as a ruler, how to hold yourself, your bearing, and all of these kind of personal kind of dimensions of personality and character and so on, to try and teach people where leadership lay and how you might promote and project a sense of confidence and authority by having the right kind of moral character. This is one kind of these ancient sort of theories and ideas, fairly bankrupt, let's just acknowledge and admit, about what makes a real, a good ruler. I mean, this is the time where actually opposing the popular will is valorized in a lot of these elite manuals of governance, right? But they also do move beyond this kind of comportment and character, and looking at examples of great earlier rulers and how they conducted themselves in various situations that you might pattern yourself and learn from them. But they also talked about principles of governance and statecraft, how to rule in a practical way, how you have to organize your bureaucracy, and how to avoid, for example, corruption or rebellion by governing in a kind of clever way and in that sort of way. And again, historical examples would be used to show continuities between the current era and previous eras that were regarded as prosperous, powerful, with wise and just rulers. So, for example, in the Islamic context, for example, somebody like Harun al-Rashid, who is the caliph in Baghdad, who appears in a lot of the stories of the 1001 Nights, the Alf Layla wa Layla, the Arabian Nights, right? These stories, this frame tale that has stories within stories, and is a very kind of long, obviously 1001 Nights kind of set of connected stories. They're separate stories, but they're connected by an overarching frame tale, which is that Scheherazade is storytelling to the king who has this brutal practice of, after having, I can't remember the exact kind of condition that brought him to this stage, but I think he had some kind of betrayal, and so no longer trusted, women, and so he was like marrying, and then after one night, then executing. And Shahrazad is, however, able to forestall her execution and death by telling such amazing stories that always have these cliffhangers at the end or at the conclusion of the story, when the king is like amazed at this incredible anecdote or this incredible narrative. She says, well, but that's nothing compared to such and such. And, and said, oh, okay, well, we better come back the next night and hear that story, and so on. The figure who's very popular in these stories that are told is Harun al-Rashid, because in the late 8th and late 8th century was this period during the Abbasid Empire. That's the Abbasid dynasty, was ruling the largest contiguous land-based empire in the history of the world, until maybe, you would say, the coming of the Mongols under Chinggis Khan in the 13th century. It ruled basically from territories extending across North Africa, from Morocco, or the Maghrib as it was known, the furthest west point, the place of the setting sun in the west, all the way across, as I said, North Africa, the Levant, the Arabian Peninsula, into the Iranian plateau, and parts of Central Asia and parts of northern India, all the way to the frontiers with China. So this was like a vast empire. And so this ruler, who was really at the apex of this global world historical polity, is looked back upon as representing the very height of culture, civilization, and so on, for not only Islamicate literary scenarios, but also in the histories. Subsequent histories and subsequent advice manuals may go back to the example of Harun al-Rashid and use him as a way of illustrating. Whether these are true or false stories, very often it's not clear whether they can really be documented, whether they really happened, but they are meant to illustrate an example for a contemporary ruler. And the same is, you can see for Alexander, right? If there's a aspiring military figure, then you're supposed to study and recognize the example of Alexander as somehow worthy of emulation and learning from, right? So that's this kind of older style and understanding of history that is very connected with fiction, in the sense that its value is that it's supposedly about real people and real figures, and is an example or sets precedents that we can learn from, what to avoid and what you might do, right? Like, don't follow this example, follow this other figure, they were successful, etc. But this kind of set of stories didn't necessarily have to be grounded in what we would think of as documented fact, right? And so there's this kind of boundary borderline between fact and fiction that was always undermining and making, historical writing in the form of chronicles somewhat suspect. And so the writers of these chronicles are always attempting to affirm the verisimilitude of what they're narrating and talking about. However, what they did is that they would string these stories somehow in a kind of narrative that follows, according to Hayden White, coming back to Hayden White, follows genre conventions more than it follows what we might think of as the rational scientific analysis. And this is an insight that he had as a critique of what we might call historiography, the practice of writing history. So there's a difference between history, i.e. what happened, and history as a discipline of studying the past, and historiography, which is the actual writing and formulating of history. And what he introduced in an interesting way, there already was a kind of tradition within historical study to recognize that there were different ways of explaining why events happened. So take, for example, a classic case, the French Revolution. What caused the French Revolution, right? So historians would have their own ways of trying to explain the causes and therefore the consequent events that happened that they considered very important and worthy of investigating to explain. So you wouldn't necessarily waste your time in this older tradition of historians that was based really upon great political events, great political figures, which even after the Enlightenment was still very important in 19th century, 18th and 19th century historical study and historiography in the writing of history, where, for example, somebody like Napoleon was regarded as like a second Alexander, as a great man in history, and this kind of way of thinking that the personality and the charisma and the characteristics of these great figures ends up transforming history, and you can explain different ages and periods of history through studying the life, character, and deeds, right, of the great figures, these great men, and almost always were men, right? You know, we might have a Catherine the Great here, or, you know, an Elizabeth the First there, and so on, but fundamentally this was a story of political elites, and usually male-dominated, political and military elites, right? And so they were seen as causing change through the force of their intervention in history, their making of history themselves through their personality and their character. That obviously goes a little bit by the wayside when there's more of a developed kind of analysis that looks at other kinds of evidence and sees that there are other structures that are very important. And this is, of course, again, where people like Marx are theorizing a turn and a shift to understanding history by looking at material conditions and at forces rather than figures, you might say, as necessary. But even so, if you were trying to explain, even if you were trying to explain the French Revolution, you know, there are a lot of different ways that historians might account for the events that led up to it. They would select certain kinds of events to focus on. That was part of presenting a vision of an explanation, the vision of the past as an explanation. And what Hayden White kind of suggested is that the different kinds of causal explanations and different ways of writing the history of something, say, like the Haitian Revolution or the French Revolution or the American Revolution, for example, you know, fell into different literary genres, that you could see the arc of how the narrative of the argument was being unfolded, and that these were like ironic or they were romantic, right? So he ended up treating the writing of history much like, you know, in some ways had always been the accusation against ancient tellers of stories about the past, from whether it was Herodotus, who was accused of, you know, making up a bunch of things by subsequent people, or, you know, others, even Ibn Khaldun. He spends like the first couple of chapters really talking about the errors of previous historians and how they retailed fictional accounts that just couldn't be true. And he analyzed them by looking at them materially and saying, well, look, this can't actually happen that way, and offering this kind of critique. So there already was a sort of disreputable kind of crossing of the boundaries in some ways between fable and history, between fact and fiction, that historians, when they became more professionalized and started becoming a serious discipline of knowledge in the 19th century under somebody like Ranke, who was using these archives and saying what we really need to do is establish what really happened, wie es eigentlich war, how it really was. That's the task of the historian, and they started progressing in a different direction, with documentation and analysis and material kind of evidence and in a different sort of way, that nonetheless, both in the distant past, the writing of history, and according to Hayden White, even when it had become a professional kind of discipline, an academic discipline, a lot of the ways of explaining things and the way in which historiography was written as a narrative could be understood through literary critiques and analysis that would essentially predict in some ways the kinds of conclusions you're going to come to by the way in which you framed your narrative. And so this was actually quite a epistemologically difficult realization for the professional historians who had become by this point invested in the idea that they were engaged in a very serious, rigorous attempt objectively to try and study the past. And he was saying, well, what you're coming up with is essentially like literary structures, which suggests in a way that our habits of thinking are perhaps more significant and important in this aspect. In even how we study the past, we're very invested in certain ways of thinking about it that make sense in stories or in argument that follow kind of the logical steps, you might say, of a story. So I think that was a very interesting and important kind of point. It's an important book in the history of history writing. That in some ways undermined a little bit of its authority. Anyway, I want to pause again and just tell you to like the stream. Please share it. We have about another half hour, and I want to take some questions. Maybe there won't be that much time to go really into a lot of the Ibn Khaldun and so forth. But if we get a chance, we might do it. But I want to see what else people are thinking and saying. Okay, we have Harsh. I think it may be a harsh that I may have come across before as a commenter in a different platform. If it is, it's great to see you. Welcome. He says, isn't it said history is written by winners? Is there a way around it? Oh, fantastic question. This is so important. This dictum about history being written by the winners in some ways is absolutely true. And in other ways, of course, it is highly contestable and simplifies the process by which historical knowledge is created and narratives are fabricated. They are really, I think, it is true in the sense that behind historical narratives that are successful lie, powerful interests that are capable of disseminating and promoting and making real an account of the way the world is that suits and serves their purposes. So yes, very often, as professional historians studying the past, we bemoan the fact that we don't have the sources and the evidence from the perspective of the people we often would most like to understand, because there has been always, through the centuries and maybe you could say millennia of recording and leaving and preserving evidence that has always emphasized and over-exaggerated in some ways the role and importance of the powerful, the wealthy elites, right? They're the ones who can pay, i.e. patronize the historians to write their histories. They're the ones who have the resources to keep records, the knowledge of writing, the education, knowledge of writing, and the ability to keep records of what happens. And usually these were begun with things like tax records, right? The harvest has come in. How much was the harvest? And therefore, how much does everyone in this district need to pay? And recording and keeping that so that the next year you could say, well, this harvest was even better. Maybe we're going to tax more, or we expect, even if the rate is the same, we expect to have a greater outcome. And the people who had the records written down had now fabricated a form of knowledge that could be institutionally and politically enforced in a way that the peasant themselves can't say, hey, look, it was a bad harvest. Last year was really good. This one wasn't so great, or to contest that knowledge the way it's been recorded from the perspective of the state. That is, the governors, the rulers, the people who have an investment in, extracting resources. We would love to know, as historians, what's the perspective of the peasant? How did they feel about it? How did they contest these things? Were there revolts, rebellions? How did they deal with this situation? What was their kind of experience? And so there was a turn towards doing more popular history, like everyday history, a day in a particular location and time, a day in the life of, and people who started doing what was called social history, demographic history, environmental history, prosopographical studies of classes of people where the individual may not have left a trace in an obvious way, very articulately, in a written document that we may have, but you could reconstruct it from other records about a class of people and bring together the surviving fragments of many people's experience who shared a certain kind of situation, right? They were artisans in like a craft guild workers, say carters, or leather workers in a particular city, and we have certain kinds of records about it, even if we don't have a lot of testimonies, and we may not even always know the names of many of these individuals, but we can put together a diverse set of evidence that survives to try and reconstruct something of what might have been shared by people who inhabited this kind of condition. That's the kind of thing that started to happen. One of the most famous kind of schools of history is the Annales school. It started in France, and there were some very important and famous historians who had this turn away from mere political history, studying the events of great figures, but actually trying to understand the environmental and geographic and social conditions and structures that patterned human social and economic life, and to have more of history from below. And that's another school or orientation in history. Those who were interested in anti-colonial perspectives outside of the imperial interests and aspirations, but to reflect and understand the colonized people's perspectives and understanding. So they did what was called history from below, and subaltern studies actually started with peasant studies, in fact, because this was a group within human history that has seldom documented itself in the same way. So we don't have those sources. We've had to turn to other things. And now we have techniques where you can study, tree rings. You can see what's happening in the climate, and there might be archaeological records, or there might be, other things that are not written records, but are evidence of history. And people have done deep histories of geologic histories and so forth. This kind of mapping of a whole terrain of history, natural history, geologic history, environmental history, is this kind of fundamental change in the base and sources through which we can try and reconstruct conditions of life, conditions of society, and its consequences on the environment, to try and give a very different perspective from the way the winners have often written it, where they've only emphasized and paid attention to the elite public figures. It's like, for example, writing the history of today only by, we have totally different problems today because everyone is self-documenting and there's so much evidence and information. But just think about it, if all you had were the records and tweets of Elon Musk, the statements of Elon Musk and Donald Trump and Joe Biden, on which to go on, right? That's what was preserved, that was recorded and kept, and the resources were mobilized to preserve the continuation of this kind of documentation of what's important either by the logic of the state or by, the wealthy, the powerful, and the elite having the resources to be able to promote their own vision of themselves and project that forward. If you were trying to study the history of our period right now, and all you had were Biden's speeches, okay, about the genocide, for example, but you had nothing that was available to you in this unique moment where we are in a global historical period of change. World historical events are taking place. We have at this moment access to many Palestinian voices sharing their situation, their experience, their humanity, their dignity on social media. But imagine the kind of history you would be constrained to write if you only had a limited set of these sources. That's for most of human history the situation we're dealing with. In the period that I study, for example, medieval European, medieval Middle Eastern history, but let's take the medieval European side of it on the northern shore of the Mediterranean, is that for a long period of time there wasn't a great deal of literacy and record keeping except in certain classes of society, particularly in monastic houses and by clerics. And so almost all of the documentation and written records that historians use as evidence, as primary sources from which they derive their understanding of the past, were coming from a clerical perspective. You definitely have an invested and ideological vision of the society. And so how do you get around it? As I mentioned, there have been some of these innovative techniques to use non-written sources that might help us at least put a different kind of framework around it. But in the modern age, there's two things that one could do. One is read against the grain. This was one technique of not taking the sources themselves uncritically that have been created by these institutions and powerful interests, by clerics and monks keeping records for their own purposes, or by states, kings and their chanceries and the diplomatic letters that they send back and forth, negotiating things between other elites, the historical chronicles that they patronize. Nonetheless, sometimes even in these records that ideologically speaking reflect the values and the interests of certain classes of elite opinion and ideological orientations that they have, nonetheless, there are occasional moments where you see something shifting or contradicting or challenging and having to be dealt with. So it's not that everything is always completely ignored. It's sometimes that they portray and represent in a particular negative light resistance that takes place. So a peasant revolt may be mentioned that it actually happened, but in the context of decrying how villainous and horrible these people are and how it caused so much disorder, and as a result, there was so much poverty or something, i.e. blaming the victims, right? But that might be a moment in which if we asked different questions and we didn't read uncritically these sources, we might gain insight and a different kind of analysis that would allow us to reproduce and reconstruct at least some elements of the history from below, the history by those who are the oppressed of history, the victims of the winners, right? I wouldn't say the losers of history because it's an ongoing battle. Nobody loses in history if they keep fighting. That's what we're finding out, of course, today, even at this very moment, that there is if you continue to resist, you cannot ultimately be completely defeated. So, that's one technique, and examples of it. So I just mentioned that in medieval European, Latin Catholic sources, there are a lot of monastic chronicles. There are clerical records, the priests and so on who studied religious doctrine and theology and were trained in the universities. University of Paris, for example, in the 13th century, they often also wrote about troubling episodes of heresies, right, of heretical movements, or either heretical beliefs that were expressed maybe by other people who were learned and they might be condemned, or popular heresies in terms of movements where they were contesting parts of Catholic doctrine, right? Belief in the efficacy as a sacrament of infant baptism. This was being contested by the Petrobrusians. We don't know much of anything about the Petrobrusian heresy, except what Peter the Venerable, the abbot of Cluny, has to say about them. And they're only called the Petrobrusians because there was the figure who seems to have been, according to Peter the Venerable, known as the ringleader, was, Peter of Bruce, or I'm forgetting his name actually, but Petrobrusians came from the name of the figure, of certain Peter. And we wouldn't know about this figure if it wasn't something that had been seen as some kind of a danger to make an example of, or a group's ideas that had to be refuted. And one of the things that was so concerning and disturbing about this religious movement's ideas and beliefs was their rejection of the efficacy of infant baptism. And they looked to earlier cases like the time of John the Baptist, right, himself, and there was a lot of adult baptism, and they believed that since it was meant to be a kind of conversionary commitment to a holy life that cleansed all of your sins, it didn't make sense for this to be something that happened in infancy, for a being that was pre-rational, hadn't committed no sins, was innocent, and this idea that's invented and promoted of original sin, as being inherited, was less important than it being an active choice to commit to the church, and it would be efficacious if it happened when you were able to actually understand the consequences of, right, the sacrament of baptism, right? But this was anathema to the church, and so we find out about it because there seem to have been movements that contested Catholic doctrine in this way and are then documented. Well, we need to be very careful with these sources because there's a lot of fears and anxieties and moral and panics and paranoia. If people recall, famous book by Douglas Hofstadter, The Paranoid Style of American Politics. He was a great American historian, very conventional sort of liberal figure, but this was an interesting thesis about the style of conspiracy theories, very relevant in some ways today. It's worth going back and talking about that. But his point in some ways reflects the fact that there's been a lot of projected fears and anxieties that are manufactured as a way to extend, control, governance, surveillance, and so on. So you don't want to just accept that in fact there was this group and they were saying and promoting doctrines exactly in the form that seemed to be the most challenging to what the church was very concerned to promote and protect. But history is dialectical, and the promotion of a certain kind of theological doctrine or practice may have generated, in attempting to impose it, generated counter responses. And this gives us insight then into people who we never hear from, or we seldom hear from themselves. We would love to have a lot of sources written by, the Petrobrusians, for example, or other heretical groups. We have, in some cases, sources that have been preserved, but very often, for example, even the Cathar heresy, apparently a dualist heresy for which the Albigensian Crusade was launched in the early 13th century. Many of the sources about what did these adherents of the Cathars believe and what were their practices, this is all generated principally through investigation under torture in the Inquisition. Like, this is the occasion in which Inquisition was developed, was actually first for the Albigensian heretics, the Cathar heretics in principally southern France, is the main location in Provence, in southern France, in the Languedoc region. And so as a result, we have generated an awful lot of information about the Cathars that we're not sure exactly whether you can trust. You can use them as sources and evidence, highly contestable, and you may make some arguments and others will not agree because they may not trust your interpretation of the evidence or trust that the evidence itself is factual because there's an investment by the church in, or not even just an investment, but a propensity towards generating its own fears, right? Self-fulfilling kind of fears. But those sources are, among those that you might read against the grain to try and get some sense of the voices of those who were the victims and subjects of oppression in history, the weaker, the not so powerful, the everyday. These are things that we're very interested in. But in the more modern period, one of the ways around it is, of course, to examine actual anti-colonial writings that really reverse many of the paradigms of the official record and the official histories. And we have amazing cases, for example, of the way in which the British in Kenya, a settler colonial, a settler colony of the British in Africa, was resisted and led to incredible repression, where hundreds of thousands of people were interned, maybe millions of people were interned in concentration camps, relocating them from the land, and British records really minimize, the consequences of this, the casualties. We have incidental kinds of reports, minimizing of the figures. But if you listened to the testimonies, oral testimonies that were then put in documentary form, you get a subaltern view that in large part has actually been validated when secret archives that had meant to be destroyed are actually found, sometimes still existing. And there's a great historian, Caroline Elkins, teaches at Harvard, who wrote a book, a really important book about this a decade and a half ago or so, and has continued to work on the history of settler colonialism, but even also wrote a very important book on the history of British imperialism that has tried to document and put together the truly devastating consequences of the British Empire, or of British colonialism globally around the world. And so subaltern history, a school of history that I was talking about, of history from below, of anti-colonial perspectives, sometimes using the British archival materials and records, but reading against them, finding other sources to kind of match against, the official record, to evaluate it, and posing these critical questions and seeking other kinds of documentation is what has allowed counter histories to be written, anti-colonial histories, histories of resistance. And that's very important work. There are ways around the winners writing history. That is to do our own kinds of history and to value the experiences and the sources and the testimonies that might be outside the official archive that historians have always relied upon, and to go outside of those archives to find new sources, to read against those, and to tell these other sorts of stories. It's true that it may be harder work. It may be less verifiable in certain ways, but by working, effectively with disciplined approach and valuing the experience of people who have been enslaved or under colonization. And that's another whole area, right? Where the slave narrative is that we had a few precious sources where people enslaved African descendants, African descended peoples who had been enslaved in the Western Hemisphere occasionally had access to literacy and wrote testimonies of their experience. And these were so important in reframing the experience of enslavement. So all of these subaltern, these would, happily be denied, happily be suppressed, happily be de-emphasized, which is why, of course, critical race theory supposedly is some grave danger to the American educational system, because it was a methodology and orientation in legal study that developed also reliance upon cases and histories that could validate the claims for reparations, for the longue durée of racial oppression, to actually use those histories and critical faculties to try and contest them, to tell different stories, and to use those in seeking justice and reparations in the present. And that's why these histories of those who are not the winners are constantly being suppressed, is because they would contest the validity and the legitimacy of the claims about why the world is the way the world is. Did it have to be that way? Or were there actions taken and perpetuated in order to aggrandize, the wealthy and the powerful? And then they've told us a story of the necessity of it working out that way. That's why history is absolutely so vital, that we do tell these other stories. And that's why, in some ways, I started Guerrilla History, is to just increase the consciousness of other ways of insurgent and resistant historical knowledge and narratives, and to deploy them, not just learn about them, but deploy them in changing the way we approach politics and our understandings of what is possible. That's the whole idea. So, sorry, just a moment. So, what I would like us to do, and perhaps I'm thinking actually about developing an online course that people might be interested in at some point in the coming year or so. There's so much to do and so little time to do it. But one thing I would like to do is do a kind of basic training for being a guerrilla historian, right? Boot camp. History boot camp, like, theories, methods, practices, sources, archives, and using history as a weapon of liberation. I think that's so important. That's why I'm so fascinated by history, and why I do some of the public historical educational projects that this channel is a part of, is to inculcate this idea that we must foster a sense of his resistant, insurgent, guerrilla historical consciousness. Okay, that was a great question, Harsh, and you got me off on a rant. We're getting close to our 90 minutes, which is, typically we try and go for about 90 minutes, and it's now 11:30 p.m. here in the UK, but I'm feeling very awake because, of course, I'm on a different time zone. But I do want to try and bring this, to some sort of conclusion in the coming, little period here. But also, I do want to say, before I turn to some of your comments, again, is please do like the stream. Make sure other people can hear about it. Share it on social media now. Even if they can't join the majority of our live discussion here, they can watch it back, and they'll know about it. And I just want to go through, a few of the comments that I'm seeing. Okay, Danny Ferguson says, what can we, the people, do to reduce the probability of nuclear war, given that both parties in the USA seem committed to go the opposite direction? Wow, that's not really a history question. That's a question exactly about the future and how we can make sure to have a future, much less a just and equitable future, which is what I was saying we should study the past for. But yeah, this is an extremely dangerous time, and I think in addition to the United States' political elites on both sides of the political elite, the two factions of the two capitalist parties, the two factions of, contemporary American hegemony and imperium, despite their kind of commitment, it seems, to continuing war everywhere and anywhere, and particularly even in the context of with other nuclear powers, be it, the proxy war in the Ukraine, the withdrawal from several arms treaties that happened first. The first one that I can't remember the exact name of, under George W. Bush, and then in the first Trump administration, getting out of the INF treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. I can't remember if that's the correct acronym. Apologies, doing this off the top of my head. But currently, I think there is another treaty. I'm forgetting the name of it. I just read a news report about it that the Trump administration has also canceled. That was the last of the agreements between the United States and the Russians over regulation and control of nuclear arms. So we are truly now in an unregulated, unconstrained environment in geopolitics, where there aren't any clear commitments made on the use between these two parties that are, frankly, engaged in a conflict. Even if the United States is not overtly deploying troops, it's not a direct war. It is a conflict between NATO and Russia in Ukraine, and this is a very destabilizing and dangerous kind of situation. But quite apart just from that, we also have constant renewal, it seems, of aspirations, at least, and some techniques and actions taking place to try and promote a kind of Cold War with China. China is constantly being demonized as a nefarious actor interfering in U.S. politics, and all the fears of the loss of U.S. Unipolar hegemony manifest themselves in these anxieties about China, China's advance in critical military and other kinds of technologies, communications, green energy, AI, you name it, right? There was I keep talking about this Australian institute that has, it's a strategic institute that puts out an annual report of its critical technologies tracker. And it's been doing it for a few years, but has also done some historical studies to see how leadership in various technologies has shifted, and scientific research and so forth. And there was a period, a couple of decades, 2 decades ago, where the U.S. was completely dominant, in all kind of major technological and military sorts of military tech fields. And now, of the 61 or so critical technologies, they track everything from solid state materials and AI and satellite and surveillance stuff, and chips and all the basically key important technologies. They have identified that China is leading in 56 out of the 61. Okay, so there is a massive shift that has happened, and the U.S. Kind of corporate elite is, of course, panicking and constantly trying to fulminate against nefarious Chinese influence, and trying to explain this as a question of their theft of, U.S. technology, all these kind of absurd narratives. But China has a nuclear power, right? This is, again, that kind of, there should be some constraints and limitations on the kinds of rhetoric in world diplomacy, on the kinds of actions being taken to avoid confrontation between these nuclear powers. Even we just recently had India and Pakistan have a brief, very short war. I don't know if you could call it a war, but it was definitely air skirmishes and other kinds of confrontations taking place. And of course, we also have a festering situation in West Asia, where the only nuclear power in the region, an undeclared nuclear and its undeclared nuclear arsenal of weapons, Israel, has, according to documented reporting by somebody like an investigative reporter, Cy Hirsch, a Samson option as a nuclear doctrine, which is the willingness to use, if it is fearing a existential threat from conventional military forces, to use nuclear weapons in the region, right? And of course, with all the apparent concerns about the Iranian nuclear program, which are really just principally concerns about the Islamic Republic of Iran and attempting regime change of it. What we have is yet another kind of venue in which, or kind of confrontation and region of confrontation, where, again, the possibilities for the use of nuclear, weapons and of nuclear war keep ratcheting up. So I think this is a very serious problem. How do we reduce the probability of nuclear war? I mean, well, if we had democracy, which is unfortunately what we are increasingly learning more and more all the time, is how limited our actual role is in the decision-making of the leaders of so-called Western, democracies, be they the UK, Canada, the United States, etc., France, Germany, that we have to think about, what is the real way to prevent this ever-increasing possibility? We need to encourage getting back into nuclear arms treaties. We have to be opposing war in general, all of these wars, regime change wars, imperial wars, and so forth, because those only lead to the possibility of ratcheting up the tensions into a situation where there could be the use of nuclear weapons. But ultimately, of course, what do we really need? We really need, a revolution. We need regime change ourselves in our countries, where they actually reflect the popular will and popular interest, rather than these manufactured conflicts that serve the military-industrial complex in our military Keynesian economy. Anyway, a really interesting, kind of question and concern. There's so many comments, I can't really read all of them, and we are now at almost 100 minutes, and so. But I just want to, kind of come through and acknowledge. We see a great comment here, Sasha Rombouts, and lots of good discussion happening in the chat. Red Kitty says, Ibn Khaldun, please. Oh, I know. And that was a long time ago. So I'm totally behind in looking at the comments. And we didn't accomplish that much of what I wanted to talk about, in terms of specific topics. But I hope it was kind of useful, at least in doing two things. One, explaining what's at stake and what's of value in studying history. So the why history part, that at least we establish something very important about the need for historical study, that is very important. And secondly, pardon me, secondly is the approach that we should take to history. And that comes from great questions and comments that you made, which is that we have to direct our form and interest in history around liberatory struggle, around, the voices, the subaltern voices, and to try and use it as a tool, for social, political, and economic change. So if we could, I think, take away those two important things from today's conversation, we'll have other opportunities, I hope, to explore some more specifics, to get to your questions. I will try and read these comments myself to go back afterwards and see if there are some topics or themes that could be good subjects for further exploration in future office hours where I go solo and go off on my own. I mean, I agree. See here again, another thing. What's different about these different perspectives and voices that is different from just relativist postmodernism? Though this is again like, this Hayden White epistemological criticism. What's, kind of going to guide us to actually approach the study of history for liberation while still being seriously engaged in material analysis, right? That's what's important. This is, of course, an unresolvable question. There is no, kind of, real answer to this. So thank you, Sina. So there's a lot. I'll go through them because I'm actually starting to lose my voice a little bit from basically doing an hour and 40 or 50, 40 minutes or so of almost monologue. This is the problem with not having a guest, is that you just end up having to generate all of the discussion yourself. And so I will go through these great comments. I'm just scrolling through them, actually just really wonderful. And I can see that there's a, spirit of fun in the comments too, in addition to Sina's, producer Sina's, derisive, I'm assuming, but maybe I shouldn't be so uncharitable, kind of remark there, fake question, is it generated a lot of funny back and forth. And that's something that I'm really glad to see. I think these Friday nights, we're here to learn, but also to have some, fun talking together. And I think you've been having that fun in the chat with a lot of like witty remarks and so forth. So I'm really looking forward to going back over the comments from the live stream. And as I said, I will collect some themes or topics that we can go into in greater depth in future editions of Office Hours. Next week, there is no Office Hours, unfortunately. I'm traveling. I might try and do a makeup Office Hours on a different time, but it can't be on Friday because I'll be traveling. There should be, hopefully, a struggle session live stream with a panel on Sunday. I'm still October 19th. I'm still putting it together. Oh, wait a minute. What am I saying? October 10th is next. I'm always so bad with the dates. October 10th is next week. So I might try and do a follow-up. Actually, I might have Sina on. In fact, actually, that's what we were thinking about next week. We might do Shi'ism and the history of Shi'ism and contemporary. So if that works out, look out for that. We may do something. It'll be midnight where I am, but I might do that because that's going to be, a great topic, but it's on the 17th that I won't be able to do Office Hours. So that's what I need to tell you. October 17th, Friday, October 17th, I won't be able to have Office Hours. Might make it up some other time, but that weekend on the 19th, Sunday, we're supposed to have a struggle session that I'm organizing, which is a panel live stream with a bunch of guests talking about what's going on in the world and what we can do about it or how we should think about it. So I might not make up the office hours right away then, because we'll already have a live stream opportunity for this community to come together to continue in its learning and conversation. But we'll see about the 10th. I hope I'll be back next week on Friday. But watch. The best way to find out, of course, is follow me on X at Adnan A. Husain. Instagram is the same at Adnan A. Husain. And you can also subscribe to the channel here, right? That's a good way. If it's going to be a live episode, I'll post it here and you'll get a notification, but you have to like this stream and subscribe to the channel. Okay, friends, comrades, I'm really going to enjoy reading the chat. I can see that. A lot of great stuff. If I could do two things at once, think and read at the same time, I would have come to more of your questions, comments, and remarks. But until next time, I want to wish all of you a wonderful week ahead. Do support Resistance is Fertile. Watch them on the other platforms where they currently exist. And if there is a mechanism that Benji or Sasha has shared on social media or in the chat here for ways in which we can contest and show our support and desire for Resistance is Fertile to come back onto YouTube as a vital show, let's go ahead and do that, okay? So during this week, I hope you all enjoy a little bit of peace with justice and solidarity. Salam, everyone. Until next time. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.